You thought being available made you valuable. You answered every call. You showed up without being asked. You explained yourself before they even questioned. You became predictable, not because you were weak, but because you were trying to be loved. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But most people never get there, because before you become yourself, you become what they needed. A helper, a fixer, a warm presence they could summon like a servant, and little by little you were taught, not with words but with reactions, that your worth was in how quickly you responded, how available you stayed. You were rewarded for self-erasure, for showing up even when you were exhausted, for giving even when you were empty. You thought that made you good. But Carl Jung would call it something else. A survival mask. The persona. A false self built to win approval, while your real self is locked behind the curtains, watching in silence, screaming in dreams. Because the more they applauded your kindness, the more you forgot who you were without it. You weren't helping them. You were hoping they'd finally help you feel like enough. But here's the truth, Jung would whisper. They didn't love you. They loved their access to you. And the moment you stop performing, they don't miss your soul. They miss their grip. This isn't love. It's dependency in disguise. And your availability, your need to always explain, soothe, and serve, was never proof of connection. It was proof of fear, the fear that if you said no, they'd leave. But Carl Jung said something darker. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And when you disappear, when you finally stop performing, they're forced to face theirs, and most can't stand what they see. So they won't reflect. They'll blame you, call you distant, call you arrogant. Say, you've changed. But what they really mean is, you're no longer predictable. You're no longer mine. And that's when the mask starts to crack. Not just theirs, yours. Because deep down, you weren't born to serve their comfort. You were born to confront your shadow, to stop trading your presence for acceptance, to stop bleeding your energy for people who only clap when you're easy to control. So here's the question Jung would leave you with. Who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when no one is clapping? And are you brave enough to become him? Because somewhere inside, you is the man you were before the mask, a fire that flickered before they taught you to dim it. He's still there, not gone, just waiting, like a lion behind glass, calm, silent, but no longer tamed. The psychological power of absence. Let's make something clear. Withdrawal is not retreat. It is not surrender. It is not silence born from fear. It is silence forged in clarity. Carl Jung believed that we reclaim ourselves not through noise, but through solitude. He said, your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. And the moment you start looking inward, you realize just how loud the world has been. How many of your words weren't truly yours. How much of your presence wasn't offered. It was demanded. You didn't give. You were taken from. Every text you answered, every call you rushed to, every moment you sacrificed just to prove your goodness. It wasn't connection. It was compliance. They didn't need your presence. They needed your obedience. But the moment you withdraw, not out of spite, but from sacred intention, you become dangerous. Because now, they can't read you. They can't predict you. And in a world addicted to control, unreadability is power. Jung understood this on a spiritual level. He didn't call it revenge. He called it individuation, the painful, necessary process of becoming whole by separating from who they trained you to be. And the first step, disappearance. Not forever. Just long enough for the mask to fall. Long enough for the silence to echo. Long enough for them to realize they didn't value you. They used you. Used your consistency. Used your peace to avoid their own storms. Used your presence to soothe wounds they had no intention of healing. But here's the shift. When you disappear, really disappear, the power dynamic flips. Suddenly, they're left alone in the places you used to fill. No replies, no explanations, no predictable kindness to wrap themselves in. And that silence, it screams. It forces them to confront everything they refuse to face while you were still reachable, because your availability acted like a buffer, protecting them from their own emptiness. And now, without you, they're exposed. But you start to see what you've never seen clearly before. Your time is a currency. Your energy is a resource. Your presence is a privilege. And you've been giving all three, and you've been giving all three away like loose change. So now, you stop, not to punish, but to restructure the economy of your soul. Jung would call this the shadow rising, the part of you that says, I will no longer be your comfort zone. I will no longer trade my peace for your approval. It feels cold, it feels sharp, it feels unlike you, but that's because you've never truly met your full self, the part of you that doesn't explain, that doesn't beg, that doesn't chase. Because true transformation begins when you're willing to become the absence they fear, not the echo, not the yes man, not the backup plan, the void. And once you do that, once you reclaim your space, your silence, your energy, you stop orbiting them, and they start orbiting you. The strategic scarcity effect. There is a reason rare things are worshipped, a reason gold is locked behind glass, why ancient texts are stored in vaults, and why the moment something becomes unavailable, people suddenly want it more than they ever did when it was freely offered. Carl Jung believed this wasn't just economic, it was psychological. He said, people will do anything to avoid facing their own unconscious. But when something they're used to suddenly disappears, that unconscious rises. Scarcity triggers desire. Not because they suddenly value your soul, but because they've lost the illusion of control. Your presence once wrapped them in safety. Your voice, your replies, your constant yes. These weren't just acts of love. They were anchors until they became chains. And here's the dark truth. As long as you were predictable, you were forgettable. They didn't admire you. They depended on you. And dependency never breeds respect, only entitlement. You gave them everything. And in return, they treated your presence like oxygen, invisible, expected, automatic. So what happens when oxygen is cut? They panic, not because they love you, but because the supply chain broke. Jung would say, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And that's exactly what your disappearance does. It reveals the true motives that were hidden beneath their affection. Because when you're no longer available, the friend who only calls when he's bored goes silent. The lover who took your devotion for granted starts posting louder. The family member who never asked how you're doing suddenly wants to check in, but you already know it's not about you. It's about access. You were easy to reach, so they reached. Not to give, but to take. And now that window has closed. there's a story Jung might have told, not from a psychology textbook, but from the quiet corners of real life. Imagine a man who lived next to a bell tower. Every hour, on the hour, it rang, loud, powerful, unmissable. At first, the sound made him pause. He noticed it. He felt its weight in his bones. But over time, he stopped hearing it. Not because it stopped ringing, but because it rang too often. It became part of the noise, predictable, background, until one day, the bell went silent. For the first hour, he didn't notice. The second, he grew restless. By the third, he walked outside, not because he missed the sound, but because he was disturbed by the absence, because what he once ignored had become more powerful in its silence than it ever was in its noise. You were the bell, noticed once, then taken for granted, then ignored entirely. But now you've gone quiet. You no longer chime on command, and suddenly they can't sleep, not because they cared about the sound, but because they got used to summoning it. Your silence is not absence, it's authority. The nice guy versus the unreachable one. Think of two men in a woman's life. One texts every morning, "Good morning, beautiful." He's consistent, kind, always available. He listens, he agrees, he waits. The other doesn't text for days, replies when he feels like it, speaks with clarity, not flattery. He never begs, and he never explains. Guess who she thinks about more? Not because he's better, not because he's more loving, but because his presence is unpredictable, and his absence is felt. The first one is seen as safe, but safe slowly becomes invisible. The second, he lives in her mind, not because he tries harder, but because he reveals less. And this doesn't just apply to dating, it applies to clients, friends, co-workers, even family. The one who always shows up gets scheduled, used, taken for granted. But the one who chooses when and how to appear, he becomes a mystery, and mystery is magnetic. Scarcity builds perception, and perception becomes power. Why constant availability kills attraction, power, and self-respect. There's a lie you've been sold since childhood. If you're always there for people, they'll be there for you. But Carl Jung and life itself tells a different story. He would say, what you do not bring to consciousness appears in your life as fate. And the unconscious fate of the overly available man is invisibility. Because the more often you show up, the less they notice you. The more you say yes, the more they assume you don't have boundaries. The more you offer, the more they take, and take, until your presence becomes background noise. Like the hum of a refrigerator, always there, never appreciated, until it's gone. And then, they don't feel guilt, they feel inconvenience, because they never saw you as a man, only as a function, a source, a service, a supply. This is how availability kills attraction, not just romantic attraction, but magnetic presence, professional respect, spiritual weight. Because when you are always accessible, you create a psychological contract. You can have me anytime. But what's always available is never valuable. Think of this: the celebrity who never posts. Every photo becomes an event. The friend who never talks much. Every word feels measured. The boss who rarely enters the room. When he does, silence falls. Why? Scarcity signals importance. Selectivity builds mystique. But you were told to always reply, to be polite, to soften your voice, to make yourself easy to love. You became the nice guy. Not because you were good, but because you were trained to believe that agreeability equals value. But Jung would argue, you weren't being nice, you were avoiding rejection, You were playing the part they'd applaud, while your true self starved in the background. And it worked, until it didn't, until you realized the people you're always there for are never there when you need them. Until you noticed the more you gave, the less they listened, until you saw them chase the one who barely looked their way. While you stood there, holding your heart like an offering. It's not because they're cruel. It's because humans respond to contrast. The always there man becomes invisible. The selective man becomes powerful. Because here's what no one tells you. Respect is born from space. Attraction is born from tension. And self-worth is born from choice. If you never say no, your yes becomes worthless. If you never leave, your presence loses weight. If you never go quiet, your voice becomes noise. And worst of all, if you never value your own time, no one else will. That's how availability kills self-respect. Because every time you answer out of guilt, every time you explain what didn't need explaining, every time you interrupt your peace to soothe someone else's chaos, you're whispering to yourself, their comfort matters more than my clarity. But Jung warned us, until you make peace with your shadow, it will sabotage everything you touch. And your shadow? It's the part of you that knows you're giving too much. It's the voice inside that whispers, you're betraying yourself to be accepted by people who don't even see you. So how do you reclaim that voice? You stop being everywhere. You stop saying yes to everyone. You stop thinking that being liked is the goal. Because the truth is simple. People don't follow the always available. They follow the self-possessed. The man who chooses where he walks, who decides when to speak, who never trades dignity for approval. That man is remembered. That man is respected. That man is not available. He's intentional, becoming unreadable. The power of mystery and strategic silence. There's a moment in every man's life when he realizes being understood has cost him his edge. You wanted connection, so you explained yourself. You poured your thoughts onto the table, shared your history, your hopes, your fears, thinking transparency would earn you trust. But Carl Jung would warn, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And here's the part no one told you. When others understand you too soon, they stop respecting you just as fast. Because when people know how you'll react, they start planning around you. They start scripting your moves before you make them. They press buttons not out of curiosity, but out of control. You become a machine, predictable, soft, safe. And in a world ruled by psychology, predictability is not safety. It's expendability. You've seen it. The friend who says the same things every time gets ignored. The man who forgives every betrayal gets tested. The boyfriend who always texts first gets ghosted. The employee who always agrees gets overlooked. The moment they know what you'll say, how you'll feel when you'll show up, you've given away your power. Because the moment you become readable, you become manageable. Carl Jung taught that within every man is a shadow, a wild, silent part of us that resists being known, being tamed, being controlled. And when you silence that shadow to be liked, you don't become a better man. You become a blueprint, easy to follow, easier to forget. But when you embrace your shadow, when you stop oversharing, when you speak only when it counts, you become unreadable. And unreadable men cannot be ruled. Their silence creates distance. Their distance creates mystique. And their mystic commands rooms. That's the paradox. The less you say, the more they lean in. The more you hold back, the more they wonder. The more you disappear, the more they feel you everywhere. This is not manipulation. This is psychological discipline. Strategic silence isn't about withholding love. It's about withholding your code. You stop letting people reverse engineer you, because every overshare, every nervous explanation, every emotional outburst under pressure is like handing your enemy the blueprints to your kingdom. But when you say less, when your voice drops, when you look someone in the eye and choose not to explain, that silence does something no speech ever could. It puts the weight back in your presence. People can't play with what they can't predict. They can't manipulate what they can't understand. They can't challenge what they can't decode. And that's why unreadability is not coldness, it's control. Because you've seen what happens when you're easy to figure out. They use your kindness, exploit your openness, anticipate your forgiveness. But now, they don't know what you're thinking. They don't know if you'll return. They don't know how to get your attention. And that not knowing, that's the power they fear the most. Because mystery forces reflection, and reflection reveals weakness in the ones who are used to exploiting yours. That's why the unreadable man is so feared, because in a world screaming for validation, he walks in silence and watches everyone else expose themselves. You don't need to speak to be dangerous. You just need to be unreadable. Let the world miss you. Distance, energy, and the rise of the sovereign self. There is a moment when the game changes. Not because you fought harder, not because you shouted louder, but because you left. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in quiet command of your energy. Carl Jung said, "The most important question anyone can ask is, what myth am I living?" And for most of your life, you lived the myth of being needed. Needed as the fixer, the available one, the responder, the rescuer, the man who showed up, even when no one showed up for him. But something shifts. You wake up, and you realize your energy is currency, and every time you hand it out for free, you devalue the very kingdom you're meant to rule. So you pull back, not out of spite, but to watch what happens. And what happens? The world flinches. The ones who took you for granted start reaching. The ones who dismissed you start reminiscing. The ones who never thanked you suddenly want closure. Not because they love you, but because they lost access to the man who never asked to be celebrated, only seen. But now, you don't need to be seen. You've tasted something better. Sovereignty, the peace that comes from choosing who gets your time, the power of deciding when to speak and when to vanish, the freedom of not answering every message, not chasing every misunderstanding, not filling every silence. You are no longer a servant to their needs. You are a sovereign to your own soul. And that changes everything. People begin to notice you in your absence more than they ever did in your presence. Because now, when you walk away, it echoes, it stings, it means something. And your time, it becomes ceremonial, a rare encounter, a moment that shifts the atmosphere. Because they know, you don't just appear to be polite, you appear when it's aligned. And that's the difference between a people pleaser and a presence of power. One is expected, the other is felt. Jung would say, loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. But the truth is, you don't owe anyone communication. Not if they haven't earned it. Not if they haven't listened. Not if they've only consumed. but never poured back. Because what they miss is not connection, it's consumption. They miss how available you were, how predictable you were, how ready you were to say yes, even when your soul whispered no. But now you've outgrown that man. You've buried him with honor, but without apology, because he served you once, until he began to serve everyone else. Now you move differently. You don't chase energy, you cultivate it. You don't prove your worth, you protect it. You don't explain your boundaries, you embody them. And when people ask, "Where did you go?" you smile. Because what you found in your absence was everything you gave away in your presence. You are not here to be a background character in someone else's life. You are not here to reply out of guilt. You are not here to be the predictable yes. You are here to be felt, to be missed, to be remembered as the man who didn't ask for validation. He created distance and became undeniable. Silence is the new sovereignty. Don't expect applause when you go quiet. Expect confusion. Expect resistance. Expect whispers behind your back. Because silence forces people to hear their own guilt. They'll call you distant. They'll say you've changed. They'll label your peace as arrogance. But that's because your absence broke their mirror. They can no longer use you to reflect their comfort, their superiority, their illusion of control. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming him requires vanishing from who you pretended to be. So disappear, not to escape, but to rise, not to punish, but to purify. You don't need to block them, or explain to them, or convince them. You just need to vanish with no announcement, and let the silence speak the truth they never listened to. Because here's the final truth. In a world addicted to noise, silence is rebellion. In a world addicted to control, unpredictability is power. In a world that worships the visible, the sovereign man becomes sacred by becoming rare. Not loud, not accessible, not endlessly kind, but quiet, measured, unreadable. They don't need to know what you're thinking. They don't deserve to. Let them wonder. Let them overthink. Let them spin stories to fill the void your silence created. Because now, you are no longer the man who begged to be seen. You are the man whose absence changes the room. You are not here to be remembered for how many times you said yes. You are here to be remembered for the one time you walked away and never looked back. So let them feel the void. Let them chase the echo. Let them miss the man who finally learned the difference between being needed and being untouchable. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or used, this wasn't just a video. It was your mirror. So hit like if you've outgrown the version of you they controlled. Share this with the ones who need to wake up, and subscribe, not to follow me, but to follow the man you were always meant to become. Because in this world, silence is the new sovereignty.